very good evening. My topic for today is impact of COVID-19 in neurological disorders with focus on GBS and CIDP. So what I'll do, I'll first discuss the data regarding GBS association with CIDP, followed with the impact of this pandemic on management of neuromuscular disorders in general. So as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread like wildfire across the globe, and it has disrupted human life like no other event in the recent history. While primarily it's a respiratory disease, it has secondary effects on the neurological, hematological, renal, cardiac, and GI systems. So not just the respiratory tract, it can cause the effect of the heart, causing myocarditis, heart attacks. It can present with GI symptoms. It can cause a liver injury, kidney injury, and of course our nervous system. So regarding the neurological manifestations of COVID-19, among admitted patients, 30 to 80% exhibit neurological problems. And while in most patients, the effects are seen concurrently or within few days of the classical COVID-19 symptoms, in some, they may predate or develop much later than the initial febrile illness. And a wide spectrum of features have been observed involving different parts of the neuroaxis, both peripheral and central. So this chart just summarizes them all. Simple things like headache, dizziness to CNS manifestations like delirium, which could be multifactorial, or something called COVID encephalopathy or encephalitis, ataxia, seizures, something called acute hemorrhagic necrotizing encephalopathy, or even a steroid responsive severe encephalopathy, cranial involvements, Bell's palsy, loss of taste and sensation, loss of taste and smell, neuromuscular manifestations like myalgias, GBS, demyelination, EDEM, transverse myelitis, pediatric inflammatory multisystem syndrome, a generalized myoclonic syndrome, and of course stroke, ischemic stroke, cortical venous thrombosis, PRES, and last but not the least, the post-viral fatigue syndrome. And the commoner ones are the viral meningitis, anosmia, encephalitis, EDEM, brainstem encephalitis, GBS, myositis, and acute necrotizing hemorrhagic encephalopathy. So I'll discuss regarding GBS. So yes, this slide shows that the etiology of the pathogenesis could be vascular, like in stroke, because it's a prothrombotic state, COVID-19 infection. It could be a para-infectious or a post-infectious demyelination, or maybe even a direct viral injury, though there's no direct proof for same as of now. So this was the first case of association of GBS with SARS-CoV-2. Of course, it came from Wuhan, published in April this year. So this lady, in fact, the interesting thing is this lady, in fact, presented with paraparesis and fatigue for one day. The lab results showed by cytopenia, the CSF was normal for cell count and increased proteins, cytoalbumin dissociation, and still showed abnormal late responses. And she was diagnosed with GBS and given IVIG. But on day 8 of admission, the patient developed cough and fever. And then they did a CT test which showed ground glass opacities and the swab for PCR that was positive. So the learning points are that the early presentation of COVID-19 can be non-specific because fever is seen in only 40% of patients, 44% of patients. And the GBS associated with SARS-CoV-2 might follow the pattern of a para-infectious profile instead of the common or the classical post-infectious profile as reported in GBS associated with Zika virus. Then this another series which came from Italy in April or May. These were a series of 5 patients from 3 hospitals in Italy, where they had seen around 1,200 patients. Out of these 1,200 patients, 5 patients developed GBS. In their series, the symptom onset of GBS or neurological symptoms was 5 to 10 days after the onset of typical symptoms of fever and respiratory tract symptoms. And 2 patients had normal protein levels, and other 3 showed dissociation. That electrophysiology was generally consistent with the axonal variant in 3 patients and with the demyelinating process in the other 2 patients. This is the summary of the cases. And all of them received IVIG, and 1 patient had to get a second course of IVIG, and 1 patient was started on plasma exchange. And at 4 weeks after the treatment, 2 patients remained in ICU and were receiving mechanical ventilation. 2 were undergoing physical therapy, and 1 was able to walk independently. So this is a small series, but the authors noted that it is not possible to determine whether the severe deficits and the axonal involvement are typical features of COVID-associated GBS. and they could not determine whether the fact of reduced vital capacity due to neuromuscular failure from GBS added to the morbidity. And one point to highlight that the GBS with COVID-19 should be distinguished from critical illness neuropathy and myopathy, which tends to appear later in the course. Then there was another review article where they compared the GBS associated with COVID-19 to the typical GBS and GBS associated with dengue and Zika virus. And they noted this study was from Dr. R.K. Garg from Lucknow, and he noted that most patients with COVID-19 related GBS were elderly, where demyelinating neuropathy is more common in typical GBS and GBS associated with dengue and Zika. Majority of COVID-19 related GBS patients had Aman and Amsan variants. And more than half of the patients showed poor outcome in the form of long ICU stay, residual paresis, and dysphagia. So till now, since the first case published in April till now, for the last 4-5 months, around 20 patients of GBS associated with COVID-19 have been published in international literature. This table just summarizes them. And they have shown all of the clinical variants of GBS like AIDP, Aman, Amsan, Miller-Fisher syndrome, polyneuritis crenalis, and facial diplegia. And almost 50% of these cases required mechanical ventilation, and 10% of them died, suggesting that the GBS associated with COVID-19 is more severe than the GBS related to other etiologies, although excellent recovery has also been reported. And it's quite possible that the neuromuscular dysventilation caused by GBS adds to the COVID-19 related respiratory dysfunction, resulting in a more severe clinical presentation. And around 10 days back, they have reported a case with the pharyngeal cervical brachial variant of GBS, and of course polyneuritis crenalis and Miller-Fisher, they have been also been reported. Here I would like to discuss with this August gathering this case I saw recently in our hospital around in last month of July. So this 65-year-old gentleman, a diabetic hypertensive ischemic heart disease post PTCA, in fact visited a cardiologist on whom follow-up he was regular visiting, with complaints of fatigue, lethargy, difficulty in walking for 2-3 days. There was no history of any fever, cough, or dyspnea. He did the cardiologist did routine investigations. He found bicytopenia. X-ray showed some infiltrates because of the pandemic. They did a COVID PCR, which turned out to be positive. The patient had raised CRP, ferritin D dimer, and in view of the comorbidities, he was admitted in the COVID ICU. I got a call from my intensivist 4-5 days after the admission, okay, that the patient is complaining of numbness and sense of weakness in the legs. He said, just have a look at kya hai ye. And to be honest, I was hesitant to see the patient, and my initial instinct was, this is just a viral prodrome, to check his electrolytes and check his glycemic status and nothing more to do. But then I opted for a video telephonic consult. And there's some things I noted on the telephonic consult. While I talked to the patient, he had an asymmetry of features, and he had difficulty in holding both the arms and the legs against gravity. So that I suspected GBS. So first time I wore that PPE kit and went into the war zone. I went into the COVID ICU and examined the patient, and he had quadril paresis with areflexia and asymmetrical facial paresis. So we did a CSF, which showed normal cells, normal proteins almost 46, and normal sugars. So the patient fulfilled the modified Ashbury and Convalf criteria for GBS. So we treated him with IVIG, and he improved. There was no bulbar involvement. There was no respiratory failure. He didn't require any mechanical ventilation, and he was discharged after proper treatment. And as I examined him later, 3 weeks later in my OPD, last month, he was able to walk with support. So there was a few learning points I had that in this COVID scenario, though people are hesitant to see these patients due to the pneumonia or fever associated with COVID, but we have to be vigilant. We have to keep our eyes and minds open so as not to miss any neurological diagnosis with a good recovery and the adequate treatment. Another thing, usually we do a NCS before starting IV, costly treatment like IVIG, being in a corporate setup. But in this case, we had to go clinically only. I did this nerve conduction 3 weeks later after symptom onset, and it showed conduction blocks in bilateral ulnar nerves, left peroneal, markedly reduced nerve conduction velocities, and markedly prolonged distal latencies. All the snaps were absent. He was also diabetic, and FF was in most of the testing nerves. So this was a recent experience which I thought I should share with this gathering. So now, coming to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the management of neurological disorders, I would restrict the talk to the management of neuromuscular disorders or maybe symptoms of peripheral nervous system involvement. Because if I go to stroke or CNS involvement, delirium, stroke, encephalitis, and seizures, it's going to take a long. So the neuromuscular disorders constitute a group of very heterogeneous conditions which are often of genetic or autoimmune origin and affect both children and adults. They include myopathies, inflammatory myositis, dystrophies, myasthenia, dysimmune neuropathies, AIDP, GBS, CIDP, MMN, and of course anterior horn cell disorders. And the pandemic has significantly changed the current practice in treating these disorders. So are our patients with neuromuscular disease at higher risk of catching the infection or a more severe infection? Yes, they are, most of them. And the factors conferring high risk are already a muscular weakness of the chest or diaphragmatic muscles and a reduced forced vital capacity, use of a ventilation device at home, presence of tracheostomy, presence of dysphagia or oropharyngeal weakness, risk of rhabdomyolysis with fever, fasting, or infection, and concomitant comorbidities. So do we need to modify our management plan for neuromuscular diseases in view of the COVID-19? Because several of these diseases, they have immune-mediated pathogenesis, and the patients are on immunosuppressive treatment. And the extent to which these immunosuppressive drugs can contribute to the severe forms of SARS-CoV-2 is still unclear. But as of now, the various guidelines, they say that patients treated with immunosuppressants for a dysimmune pathology should continue their treatment in the absence of any manifestations suggestive of COVID-19. And we need to know and need to remember that the stopping treatment may actually lead to relapse of the disease. And we might consider a reduction in the dose of some immunosuppressive agents, or maybe shift to a lesser efficacious agent for high-risk patients. And whether to start immunosuppressive treatment for a new patient, that is influenced by how severe the risk of infection is perceived versus the risk of different treatment. And even if, unfortunately, our patients contract COVID-19 infection, the standard immunosuppressive agents like azathioprine or mycophenolate should probably continue, since effects of dosing are long-lasting, drug washout takes longer, and rebuilding of effects takes several months. However, again, if the symptoms are severe, it may be necessary to consider pausing or de-escalating temporarily the immunosuppressive drugs. And particular attention should be paid to steroid therapy because as a knee-jerk reaction, we might stop the steroids, but the abrupt interruption of corticosteroid therapy may be responsible for acute adrenal insufficiency. And it can induce a flare-up of the underlying condition, requiring higher doses later on and increase the risk of hospitalization. And to be noted is that, in fact, steroids have been tested previously in respiratory syndromes like SARS and MERS without worsening and even improving mortality rates. And now we also know that steroids like dexamethasone are one of the only proven drugs which are known to reduce mortality in COVID-19 patients. So we should not stop them abruptly and continue rather. As for biotherapies like rituximab, it is justified to maintain them if they are effective and well tolerated to avoid the potential occurrence of a relapse in conjunction with strict application of public health recommendations. But for the initiation of a biomedication in a new patient, the decision will have to be made on a case-to-case basis. Probably it's advisable to delay the initiation until the peak of outbreak is over in our region. Regarding the use of IVIG, so we know that treatment of dysimmune neuropathies like CIDP or MMECB most often involves the iterative administrations of either IV or subcutaneous immunoglobulins, the benefit of which have been widely well known. And in fact, the interruption of this therapy can result in exacerbation of symptoms of neuropathy. And also switching to oral corticosteroids is not recommended because it may worsen the disease in dysimmune motor neuropathies. And now, like everything else under the sun, even IVIG has been tried for treatment of COVID-19 disease. There are some case reports of same. And the theoretical basis is that it may provide immunomodulatory effect in hyperinflammatory states, proposed mechanism being that it can exert anti-inflammatory action, including saturation of FCY receptor binding, anti-idiotypic binding to antiviral antibodies, and binding of pro-inflammatory cytokines. But the limitations are that the antibodies are not specific, absent of variable specific neutralizing antibody titers against these newer pathogens. And the data remains inconclusive like most of the other drugs. So on the other way around, can treatment for COVID-19 have effects on neuromuscular disease? Like we know patients of myasthenia gravis, they can worsen if they are given antibiotics like azithromycin, quinolones, and beta blockers. And also in the absence of any demonstrated benefit from SCQS, and given that the exacerbation of myasthenia may be caused by this molecule, it is not probably recommended to use it in myasthenic patients with COVID-19 infection. And we also need to know, we all know this, that SCQ leads to cardiac arrhythmias, QTc prolongation, and especially if it's combined with azithromycin, which is a common day practice these days, it can lead to cardiac arrhythmias. And so also with ropinavir and some other antivirals, QT prolongation can occur. So patients who have some underlying cardiac disease, like patients with myotonia dystrophy who have QTc changes, this can lead to a lot of damage. And we know SCQS and chloroquine, they are associated with CPK rise, asymptomatic CK rise, and also myalgias. In the long term, they can lead to development of toxic neuropathy and myopathies. So the non-urgent appointment should be postponed and if appropriate, replaced by telemedicine. Things like EMG, muscle and nerve biopsies should be reserved for emergencies patients like in vasculitis, maybe GBS, myasthenia or myositis. And the admission should be reserved for emergencies only and for the conduct of treatments that cannot be postponed. So if our patients catch this COVID-19 infection and we have to manage them in the hospital, we know this is the high-risk group. Some patients who already have a respiratory failure or a cardiac involvement, patients who have been long-term treatment on corticosteroids and immunosuppressive treatments, patients who have underlying pulmonary fibrosis, maybe some patients with ILD or like inflammatory myositis, or patient with thoracic deformities or severe contractures, like awake proning is quite the in thing in these patients. So that will prevent the ventral decubitus. And then patients who have other comorbidities. So lastly, the oxygen therapy. These patients should be closely monitored and threshold for a ventilative support should be low because once this patient develop interstitial pneumonia, hypoxemia can lead to very quick clinical deterioration. And one important point that hypercapnia, if we get an ABG and shows hypercapnia, it's not a classical feature of SARS-CoV-2 pneumonia. And in fact, if your patient ABG showing CO2 narcosis, it signals the onset of respiratory muscle weakness. So it's the respiratory failure is not less likely due to the pneumonitis, but more likely due to the worsening of the neuromuscular disease. And another important point, the NIV support. Often these patients are kept of NIV support, but NIV carries the risk of widespread diffusion of exhaled air and airborne viral transmission. So it's important to have a good fitting mask, which can reduce this risk. So I will conclude by saying that COVID-19 medicine is a rapidly evolving field, and as the numbers increase, we are likely to see more varied neurological manifestations of the disease in our daily practice. And it is imperative to keep abreast of the latest developments in the field to better manage our patients and to avoid being caught unawares.